How are animals who are raised for human consumption treated, and why should we be concerned about this?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Most people would be really deeply offended and would not want to support the animal agribusiness industry if they actually knew how animals who are raised for food are treated and are raised and are killed. There are virtually no laws that are really protecting these individuals. And, in just one day, more farmed animals are slaughtered globally than the total number of people killed in all wars throughout history. And there is, I mean, just think about that number for a second. It is absolutely staggering. There is no way that this process could ever be anything other than highly violent and brutal. And even if it were, even if the number were lower, obviously there would still be violence involved because animals are being raised and killed for their flesh and other body parts. Most people do not know what's actually happening in animal factories and even in so-called, smaller farms. And this is a key reason why well-intentioned people who are compassionate, people who care about animals, people who certainly care about justice and would never want to contribute to harm toward another individual unnecessarily. This is why these same people nevertheless support an industry that really runs counter to their core moral values of compassion and care, which is caring, and justice, which is fairness.
What is carnism?
Carnism is the invisible belief system that conditions us to eat certain animals. It's essentially the opposite of veganism. We tend to assume that only vegans and vegetarians follow a belief system when it comes to eating animals. But the only reason that we may learn to eat pigs but not dogs, for example, is because we do have a belief system when it comes to eating animals. When eating animals is not a necessity for survival, which is true for many people in the world today, then it's a choice. And choices always stem from beliefs. But most people who eat animals don't recognize that they even have a choice. They're even making a choice when they eat animals because carnism is invisible. They don't recognize this belief system or ideology for what it is. Now, carnism is a particular type of belief system. It is a dominant system. That means that it's invisible. It's woven through the very structure of society to shape norms, laws, beliefs, behaviors, etc. And it's embraced and maintained by all of our major social institutions. So, when we study nutrition, for example, we're typically studying carnistic nutrition, but we don't recognize the carnistic bias because the system that gives rise to this bias, carnism, is invisible. And when we're born into a dominant institutionalized system such as carnism, we inevitably internalize that system. That means we learn to look at the world through the lens of the system. So, and carnism is structured, it is a violent system. This is the other aspect of carnism that I wanted to talk about. It's a violent system, an oppressive system. It's literally structured around violence. Meat cannot be procured without killing, and egg and dairy production cause extensive harm to animals. In fact, one could argue that they're the most brutal of all carnistic industries today. And most people, as I said earlier, would never support this unnecessary, intensive violence against other sentient beings. And yet they do eat animals. And so systems such as carnism basically need to convince people who share these core moral values of compassion and justice to act against their values and to act against their own interests and the interests of other individuals, in this case, farmed animals, without fully realizing what they're doing. In other words, carnism teaches us how not to think and feel when it comes to those animals we've classified or we've learned to classify as edible. And carnism exists, it's a global phenomenon, right? So it's, people around the world, in mediating cultures around the world, they learn to classify a small handful of animals as edible, and all the rest they learn to classify as inedible and often not only disgusting, but offensive to consume. So even though the type of animal consumed changes from culture to culture, members of all cultures tend to see their own choices as rational and the choices of other cultures as irrational and often disgusting and even offensive. And so what Carnism essentially does is Carnism uses a set of psychological defense mechanisms. These defense mechanisms distort our perceptions of meat, eggs, dairy, and the animals we've learned to classify as edible, and disconnect us from our natural empathy from these individuals, for these individuals, so that we consume them without realizing what we're actually doing. So for example, if you were sitting down and you were enjoying a delicious hamburger, and all of a sudden your friend said to you, well, actually, that hamburger didn't come from cows, it's made from golden retrievers. Chances are what you had just seen as food, you would now see as a dead animal or dead animals. What you had just felt was delicious, you would now feel is disgusting. And instead of continuing to eat that hamburger, you would probably throw it out. This is simply because you have not been conditioned by Carnism to think of golden retrievers as food. You have a much more authentic response to the experience of that hamburger than you would have previously when you thought that that hamburger was made of cows. And these psychological defense mechanisms that I'm talking about, and I know we'll come back to this later, there are a number of them, but I'll just give you an example of one of them. I mean, I just gave you an example. This is the defense dissociation. You're dissociating from the experience that you're having. I'll give you one other example. Carnism teaches us to think of or to see farmed animals as abstractions, as lacking in any individuality or any personality of their own. So we learn, for example, to think that like a pig is a pig and all pigs are the same. And so we don't feel the same connection with pigs, or certainly not with the idea of pigs that we do with dogs. With dogs, we recognize their individuality. So probably when you imagined eating that hamburger and then finding out it was a dog, you immediately thought of an individual being whose life, was now over. Whereas if you had thought it was from a cow or from another animal you'd learned to classify as edible, you wouldn't have had that thought. And so Carnism really, and we'll come back to this, I know, throughout the interview, it informs the way that we relate to farmed animals. And it is, in my opinion, a big part of the root of the problem when we talk about, trying to change agriculture and trying to address the problems of animal agriculture. As long as we're all looking at the world through the lens of Carnism, and we have this carnistic mentality that is causing us to feel defensive against anything that challenges to wake us up, it's going to be very hard to have a rational conversation about the issue. It's virtually impossible to have a rational or conversation about an issue when you're looking at the issue from the lens of the very system that wants you to continue thinking, feeling, and behaving in a certain way.